Today's podcast features 3 stories that involve people who were trapped with no way out. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Intelligence Quotient, and it's about how even incredibly smart people can make incredibly bad decisions. The second story you'll hear is called Gold Digger, and it's about how quickly things can snowball. And the third and final story you'll hear is called All the Way Down, and it's about a music follow button to Komodo Island to go apple picking, but secretly IQ, which stands for Intelligence Quotient, is a measure of someone's intelligence. To find your IQ, you need to take an official IQ test, which gives you an IQ score. The vast majority of people will score about 100 as their IQ, and so that's considered to be the average intelligence for any given person. But a very small number of people will score somewhere between 130 and 160, and so that's considered to be a very high IQ. Those are very, very gifted people. And then there is an even smaller group of people that score above 160. And so that is the genius class. Anybody who scores above 160 is literally a genius. To give you a sense of just how rare that is, Albert Einstein, who is largely considered to be one of the smartest people to have ever lived, he was not even considered a genius, at least not by his IQ. He was about 160, so right on the cusp of geniusness. But as we will learn from this story, having an exceptionally high IQ does not make you immune to making unfathomably bad choices. In 1991, 31-year-old Jackie Katarik, who had a genius IQ of 170, so she was smarter than Albert Einstein, she graduated from UCLA Medical School with honors. She completed her medical residency, which is like a multi-year apprenticeship for new doctors, at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, which is one of the very best hospitals in America. After that, she opened her very own practice just north of LA in a town called Bakersfield, California, and she also became a part-time professor at her alma mater, UCLA. By all accounts, Jackie was brilliant, she was successful, and she loved what she did, and her patients and her students loved her right back. Fast forward to 2010, Jackie was 49 years old and she was still running her very successful practice and she was still teaching at UCLA and she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with a 58-year-old man named William Moody. While the details of their relationship are not really publicly known, it's fairly easy to deduce from the reporting that came from this case that Jackie and William fought a lot. On Wednesday, August 25th of that year, Jackie was spotted by herself at a Mediterranean restaurant in Bakersfield, California, having some drinks. And then at some point during the night, she called a ride service to pick her up and take her home again. Even though we don't know this for sure, it's assumed she was too intoxicated to drive, and that's why she called the ride service. The following morning, Jackie did not show up for work. Her assistant at her medical practice is the one who noticed Jackie had not shown up. And so when she didn't, she called her boss, but her boss didn't pick up. And so after a couple of failed attempts at getting in touch with Jackie, this assistant called Jackie's boyfriend, William. And so William, he picks up the phone, and when the assistant asks him, "Hey, have you seen Jackie? She has not come into work today," William actually says, "Yes, I saw her last night." William would explain to the assistant that the night before he was in his house by himself in Bakersfield, California, not far from this restaurant where Jackie was last seen. And he said that at some point, unannounced, he saw Jackie pull up in front of his house. And so he could tell from her general demeanor and her look and her pace that she was upset about something, or he just sensed there was going to be some conflict if he went to the door. And so he decided to actually slip out the back door and kind of run away from his property before Jackie could see him. And so he actually left the property and went to a friend's house who was nearby and spent the night with this friend. And so when the assistant called William, William was actually still at this friend's house. He had not been back to his actual property. And so he would tell the assistant that, the last I saw of Jackie, it was late at night. She had pulled up in front of my house, but then I split. So I don't know what she did. I assume she left. But William would tell the assistant that, I'll go back over to my house and I'll see if she's still there or if there's some indication of where she might have gone. And so William hangs up the phone, he leaves his friend's house and walks the couple of blocks back to his own property. And when he gets there, sure enough, right out front of his house is Jackie's car. Now, William knew his house was locked and Jackie didn't have a key. And so Jackie must just be sitting in her car waiting for him to return. And so William walks up to the car expecting to see Jackie and expecting probably to fight about something. But when he gets up to the car, Jackie's not in there. But her purse, her cell phone, her wallet, that's all over the inside of the car. And so William turns and looks at his house thinking, is she in the house? Did she somehow get in? Is she on the back of the house? And so William just starts yelling out for Jackie as he begins to walk around his house. And so as he goes around towards the back of the house, he's yelling out for Jackie. No one's calling back. And then he reaches the back of the house and there's no sign of Jackie, but he sees there's a shovel on the ground near his back door. And then he looks at his back door and it looks very obviously like someone, probably Jackie, had been using the shovel to try to pry open the back door. Like they were trying to break in, but it hadn't worked. And so William just kind of sees that and then continues walking around the other side of the house. So he's completely walked around the entire property. There's no sign of Jackie. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must have gotten in somehow. She's in the house somewhere. And so William goes to the front door, he unlocks his front door, he goes inside, and even though he knows all of his doors have been locked, all the windows are locked, he's kind of on edge because he's thinking she's got to be in here. But he walks through his house and there's no sign of Jackie, and there's no sign that anybody else had been in there since he was last in there. And so he's totally puzzled because it doesn't really make any sense that Jackie's car is out front, but he's thinking, okay, maybe she got here and then she called a ride service and went somewhere else, I'm sure she's fine. So William calls the medical assistant and says, look, her car's here, her stuff's here, but she's not here. I don't know what she's doing. I'll let you know if anything comes of it. The assistant said, I really feel like something's off here and we really do need to call the police. And so William would say, you know what? I think that's a good idea too. Let's just get them involved and make sure she's okay. And so they call the police, and the police start by going to Jackie's residence. But Jackie's not there, and there's no sign of her. The neighbors haven't seen her. And so the police go to William's household, and they search Jackie's car, and they search William's house and the surrounding area right outside. But there's really no clues as to what actually happened to Jackie. And so after the police talked to a bunch of neighbors and friends and family, they just told William and this medical assistant that at this point, they just need to wait, and that hopefully Jackie will just come out of wherever it is she's hiding or wherever she's gone. Maybe she's upset. Maybe she was fighting with William and she's run off somewhere, but we just gotta wait and see what happens. 2 days later, Jackie was still unaccounted for. No one knew where she was. No one had heard from her. No one had seen her when William's friend went over to his house. William, the day before, so 24 hours after Jackie had been reported missing, he had left the country on a prearranged trip. But he was not being looked at as a potential suspect or having anything to do with Jackie's disappearance, and so he was allowed to go. And so this friend had been asked to go to his property to feed his fish. And so he shows up on Saturday, that's 48 hours after Jackie has been reported missing. He goes inside the house and immediately he is hit with this terrible smell inside of William's house. And so he's covering his face and he's walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell is coming from. He thinks it could be the fridge, maybe something's rotting that's fallen out or the door's open or something, but it's not the fridge. He goes to the trash, it's not the trash. He goes to the fish, it's not the fish. He makes his way over to the fireplace and he realizes that's where the smell is coming from. And so kind of reluctantly, he gets down and he kind of smells inside the fireplace, but it's not really coming from the area where the logs would be. It's coming from up in the chimney flue. And so he puts his head down and kind of turns and looks up the chimney, and about 2 feet up the flue, dangling down, are 2 human legs, and they would be Jackie's legs. It would turn out a few days earlier when Jackie was at that restaurant drinking by herself, she did call that ride service to come give her a ride home, presumably because she was too intoxicated to drive. But before they showed up, Jackie just got into her car anyways and drove to her estranged boyfriend's house. And so she gets there. William, meanwhile, is sneaking out the back and running off to his friend's house. Jackie does not see him. She makes her way up to the front door and presumably tries to knock and get William's attention, But when no attention is given to her and it seems like no one's inside, she decides she's going to try to get into the house. And so the front door was locked, the windows were all locked, she got to the back door, and that was locked, so she tried the shovel and tried to pry it open, but it didn't work. And so eventually, Jackie climbed up the permanent ladder that's on the back of the house. There isn't much online describing this permanent ladder. It could be a fire escape, or it could be some sort of lawn decoration, but there was something on the back of the house that you could climb up if you wanted to. And so Jackie climbed up this permanent ladder and actually got onto the roof. And then when she was on the roof, she walked to the center where the chimney was, and there was this cap over the top of the chimney to prevent things from going into the chimney. She removed the cap and then lowered herself feet first into this chimney. Now, it's unclear how quickly she descended this chimney, but eventually she got stuck because the width of this chimney was not uniform. It started fairly wide at the top and then narrowed as it went down. And so at some point, as she went down feet first, she would have gotten completely wedged. It wouldn't have mattered if her hands were above her head or by her side, because either way, they were useless. She couldn't bend her arms, and there was nothing to grab onto, so her arms couldn't do anything. And then below her, there was nothing for her feet to push onto. And so she was totally stuck. And since William was not in his house, he had left, there was no one there to help her. And so Jackie probably started screaming for help, but as soon as she did that, and she exhaled that huge scream, her chest would have constricted from exhaling, and that would have shrunk her chest, making her thinner, and she would have dropped a little bit farther into the chimney. And then when she breathed back in again, her chest would not be able to expand back to its original position because the chimney would be restricting her. It's like this brace that's around her chest that as she gets lower and lower and lower, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And so her lung capacity is shrinking second by second. And as her lung capacity shrinks, she would not have had the lung strength to emit a loud enough sound to get anybody's attention. Basically, she couldn't scream. She couldn't take in a big enough breath to scream out. And so she was just stuck in this totally compromised position in this claustrophobic little chimney where she could do nothing but wait and hope maybe William or someone took notice of the fact that she was in here, even though, again, she couldn't get anyone's attention. And so most likely she would have begun rationing her breaths because, again, every time she breathes out too much, she goes farther and farther, making it harder and harder to breathe. And at some point, starting on Thursday night, she would have heard William in the house. He would have been only a few feet away from her, but she can't make a sound loud enough to get his attention. And we know she was alive by Thursday night because neighbors heard someone faintly yelling help on Friday night. So nearly 48 hours after she got stuck in the chimney, it's believed she was still alive. And those neighbors, when they heard that faint call for help, they assumed it was kids in a nearby pool, and so they didn't do anything about it. When they found out what had happened, they thought, you know what? It was coming from that chimney. That's where we heard it coming from. Jackie would die shortly after the neighbors heard her calling for help because she was dead by the time the friend found her in the chimney the following day on Saturday. Jackie would die from mechanical asphyxia, which is basically suffocation, but it's caused by some physical obstruction. And in this case, it was the chimney. The chimney literally crushed her chest to the point where she could no longer inflate her lungs. It would take firefighters approximately 5 hours to break this chimney down to finally retrieve Jackie's body. No charges were filed against anyone for Jackie's death. It was ruled to be an accident caused by an unbelievable error in judgment by an unbelievably brilliant woman. Our next story is called Gold Digger. In July of 1988, 18-year-old Adiana and her husband, Jay Dickinson, were living in Anchorage, Alaska, just 1 month after getting married in Nevada. Jay, who had lived in Alaska for several years before Adiana joined him, had taken up an interest in something called placer mining, which is basically mining riverbeds for minerals like gold. And as soon as Adiana moved in, she picked up the hobby as well. The area they mined for gold was south of Anchorage in Cook Inlet. Jay owned a gold claim there. Over the years, Jay had found it to be very cumbersome just getting to Cook Inlet. Even though it was just south of Anchorage, the roads forced him to drive all the way around the inlet before being allowed in. However, he had discovered a shortcut. During low tide in the inlet, one of the two northern waterways that fed into the inlet, called the Turnagain Arm, would be completely dried up and it would turn into this huge open mudflat. And so Jay could leave Anchorage, go south, leave the highway at the Turnagain Arm, and drive directly over and across the mudflats and reach his gold claim in half the time. On the evening of July 14th, the young couple decided that the next day they wanted to go gold mining. And so Jay checked the tides of the inlet to see what the status would be for the next day, and he was pleasantly surprised to see that very early the next morning there would be a low tide, perfect for them. And so the next day, the couple got up at sunrise, they hopped in their Jeep, and they started heading south. They left Anchorage, they hopped on the highway, and they went south all the way to the access point to Turnagain Arm, and they looked out in front of them, and sure enough, it's completely low tide and it's ready for them to drive over. As they turned off the highway and drove down the small access road that brought them to the actual mudflats, they passed by a series of signs telling them not to go on the mudflats. But Jay had done this dozens of times without any incident, and Deanna, she'd done it only a couple of times, but both times it had been no big deal, so neither of them paid any attention to the cautionary signs. Soon they were rolling across the mudflats on their way to Jay's gold claim. But on their way, their Jeep suddenly got stuck in the mud. And Deanna, she hopped out, she went to the back of the Jeep and began pressing as Jay pushed down on the accelerator. The Jeep eventually lurched forward and was free of the mud, but Deanna was actually now stuck in the mud because as she pushed, she drove both of her legs down deep into this mud. She tried to pull herself out, she couldn't do it, and so Jay hopped out of the Jeep, walked around the mud, and got to his wife and began pulling on her. He couldn't get her out, but he told her he had a good idea. He went back to his Jeep and he got his dredge that he was going to use to try to look for gold, and he pushed it down into the mud and began sucking up the mud around one of her legs. And he figured if he just created enough of an air pocket by sucking out enough mud, she could pull that leg out, and then he could do the same thing with the other leg. And although it was a slow process, it was working, and slowly but surely they managed to get one of her legs out of the mud right as the 38-degree water began coming in because tide was starting to come in. Neither of them were panicking because the dredge was clearly working, and if they could just get her other foot out, it wouldn't matter that the water was starting to come in. They would be able to get back to land, back to the highway before they got caught in the high tide. And so he put the dredge down next to her other leg, and he began pulling the mud out, and it was working, but then the dredge broke, and he couldn't fix it. And Deanna's starting to panic, Jay's starting to panic. He puts the dredge back in the Jeep, he gets a shovel, and he runs back to his wife and begins frantically trying to dig her out, but he can barely move the mud. It's like it's cement. And that's actually the reason why there's so many signs around these mudflats telling people to not go on them. Because there's a very small window of time between low tide and high tide where the ground goes from being solid and you can drive a car on it to being very soupy, and it's very easy to get stuck in it. But before the tide completely comes back in again, it re-hardens. And so if you're stuck in the mud and you don't get out again before it hardens again, you will remain stuck in the mud and 30 feet of water will come in on top of you. And so Deanna's trying to pull her leg out and she's panicking, and Jay is doing everything he can to try to get down there and get her foot out, but the ground's hardened at this point. Her leg is completely trapped inside of the mud, and the water is starting to come in faster and faster and faster. Jay told her he had to run back to the highway to try to get some help. He couldn't take his Jeep. There was too much water that had come in. It's now up to their knees, and so their Jeep's worthless. And so Jay is running away from Adiana, who's screaming for help. She's trying to get her leg out. There's nothing he can do. And so he's running through the water. He gets up to the highway, and he manages to flag down some motorists, and he pleads with them to please come out into the water and help me get my wife out. She's stuck in the mud. And they look out and she's flailing around and screaming, and the water is now up to her waist. And so two of these motorists actually run down into the water with Jay and risk their own lives to try to get Adiana out. Meanwhile, another motorist took off for a nearby cafe where he could alert authorities that someone is trapped and they need someone out there right now. Very quickly, the fire department and the state troopers arrived on scene, and they look out and they see the motorists and Jay trying to pull Adiana out, and the water has crept even higher up on her body. She's screaming, she's panicked, and Mike Opalka, who's one of these state troopers, he immediately ran over to the fire department and he got this big rubber tube and he charged into the water and ran out to Adiana and grabbed her and said, "Everything's going to be okay, we're going to get you out of here." And he gave her the tube and he says, "You need to start breathing through this, the water's going to be over your head soon." And so Adriana, who's shaking because she's hypothermic and because she's terrified, she takes this tube and she's clutching it as the other rescue workers are running down with all their equipment to try to get her out. And then not that long after that, the tide had come in to the point where it was over her head, and all they could see of Adriana was this rubber tube she was keeping out of the water. But unfortunately, every attempt the rescue workers made failed, including getting a helicopter in and attaching a harness to Adriana and trying to pull her out that way. Nothing worked. The first responders and the motorists and everyone stayed with Diana, holding on to her and trying to pull her out, but at some point the water was too cold and it was getting too deep, and they could not stay out there with her long enough. Michael Polka, the state trooper, was the last one out there with her, and he was struggling to keep his head over the water as he's still trying to pull her up, and at some point he noticed the tube she had been breathing in popped up on the surface with both ends exposed, so it had come out of her mouth. And so he fumbled with it, but his hand was so cold from the water he couldn't really grip it. He tried to reach down to give her the hose, but she was flailing and panicking, and she couldn't get the hose. She could not breathe through it, and at some point she went still. And Mike knew there was nothing he could do. She was gone, and so he let go of her, and being hypothermic himself, he barely was able to swim back to the shore and get out and go up onto the highway with the others. And there they sat for the next 6 hours as they waited for the tide to come all the way in and then go all the way out again and loosen up to the point where they could go out and retrieve Diana's body. Unfortunately, had authorities been alerted to Diana's situation a little bit earlier, they could have got a special water pump out to the mudflats, and it would have been able to get her out even if the mud was hardened. But by the time that pump arrived on scene, it was already too late. The water was well over Diana's head, and she had already let go of the tube.
The next and final story of today's episode is called All the Way Down.
Midday on June 10th, 1981, an Italian man and his 6-year-old son walked to the edge of their property in Frascati, which is an area in Italy known as the hub of Rome's local wine industry. The father needed to repair a section of their fence, and his son, who he said had the soul of Huckleberry Finn, wanted to tag along. But as soon as the work began, Alfredo just wanted to go play in the vineyards, and so he ran off. And the father didn't think much of it because his son always played in the vineyards and just figured he would see him back at the house. When the father finished up the work around 7 p.m. and walked back into his house, he was surprised that Alfredo wasn't there. And so he asked his wife, have you seen our son? And she said, no, can you go out and find him because dinner's going to be on the table any minute. So the father goes back outside, expecting to see Alfredo come running out from behind some hiding place, but he doesn't, and he yells out for his son and doesn't get a response, and so he begins walking his property and yelling for Alfredo, and he's not finding him, and so after 2 hours of looking, he finally just calls the police. The police arrive, and initially it's just a couple of officers with flashlights, and they spend about 2 hours looking as well. They can't find him, so they call in backup in the form of officers with sniffer dogs, and the dogs began searching the property for another 3 hours, and they still couldn't find him. A little after midnight, the fire department, known in Italy as the fire brigade, they joined in as well. Shortly thereafter, a fire brigade officer was on the edge of Alfredo's property when he discovered a small hole in the ground. It would turn out Alfredo's neighbor had dug an illegal well, which was a common practice at the time, and generally, if you dug one of these wells and you struck water, you would report the well. But if you dug down and you didn't find water, you would just cover it up with a girder and you wouldn't tell anyone. In this case, however, the hole the officer was looking at did not have anything covering it, and so he knelt down and he yelled Alfredo's name into this hole, and at first he didn't hear anything. Then he yelled again, and he heard Alfredo yell back for his mother. Alfredo must not have seen the opening as he was running around playing, and he fell feet first into an 80-meter deep shaft. After Alfredo was found, the fire brigade took over rescue efforts, and so additional fire brigade units were called to help. But as soon as those additional units showed up, the captains of the different units began arguing with each other because it wasn't really clear how they were going to get him out. And unfortunately, the fire brigade immediately made a very bad decision. They decided to lower a plank into the shaft attached by a rope that he could grab onto and they could pull him out that way. But when they lowered it at about 24 meters, the plank got stuck inside of the tunnel. And when they yanked on the rope to try to free it, the rope came off of the plank, but the plank remained wedged in the tunnel, blocking the tunnel. By the following morning, TV crews had swarmed the area, and one of them offered up a two-way microphone that could be lowered down into the hole so they could talk directly to Alfredo. When the microphone was finally lowered down next to his face, he was crying and pleading for them to get him out and that he missed his mother. Amateur spelunker Tullio Barnaby, a 23-year-old, had come over and joined the vigil that night. The plank plan shocked him for its foolishness, and so too did the scene. It was like everyone and no one was in charge. The well opening had been widened in hopes that a very skinny person would be willing to be lowered down to remove the piece of wood that was obstructing the tunnel. And since Tullio was a spelunker and was comfortable in confined spaces and was pretty skinny, he volunteered himself to do it. As he was lowered down, he quickly realized the inside of this tunnel was not a straight shot. It was more like a corkscrew. And so because of its windy nature, he was not able to get down to the wood. And so he signaled to go back up again. And when he reached the surface, he didn't have the wood in hand, but he told the fire brigade that because of the windy nature, it's unlikely Alfredo fell all the way to the bottom. He's probably stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a good thing. But we have to be really careful as we pull him out that we don't do anything that unintentionally causes him to slip farther into the hole. Tullio's suggestion was they go out and recruit professional spelunkers to be involved in the rescue because they would understand how to get someone out of such a tight space so far down in the ground. But the fire brigade disregarded his advice and said we don't have enough time for that. At 6 a.m. the next day, about 12 hours after Alfredo's fallen into the swell, the fire brigade would make another very poor decision. They decided they would drill down another hole parallel to the one Alfredo was in, and they would drill down past the point they believed Alfredo was, at which point they would turn and drill laterally and connect to the tunnel Alfredo's in, grabbing Alfredo, pulling him across, and back up the new tunnel. Tullio objected, and he said the vibrations from this drill are almost certainly going to dislodge the boy and cause him to slip farther into the tunnel. But once again, the fire brigade did not listen to him. The drilling began about 2 hours later, and by that afternoon, Alfredo's plight had become major national news, with every single TV station playing a 24/7 live broadcast of the well, watching the drilling take place. Even the Italian president made a special trip to the well to see how it was going. But the drilling was very slow, and Alfredo, he had that microphone next to his head, and he was crying half the time, and the other times he was just pleading with them to get him out and saying he was cold, or that he was tired, and the rescuers would say, we're gonna be down there to get you, don't fall asleep, we're gonna get you out of there. Finally, after 36 hours, they had drilled all the way down to their intended stopping point, and they began drilling across into Alfredo's well. When they finally broke into Alfredo's well, rescuers rushed in with flashlights and looked up and looked down, and there was no sign of Alfredo. And they called it up to the top and they said he's not here. And then all of a sudden they heard a faint voice coming from all the way down at the bottom of the well. The vibrations from all of the drilling had indeed caused Alfredo to slip all the way to the very bottom. They estimated he was approximately 30 meters below this new parallel tunnel, and at that depth, the temperatures would be freezing, and so now Alfredo, on top of everything else, was facing hypothermia. They quickly lowered the microphone again down to Alfredo, and they told him, we're gonna get you out of there, we're sorry we dropped you, but we're gonna get you. And Alfredo's voice came back weak, he was tired, he was sore, he was freezing, he was crying. It was like the situation was just getting so much worse by the second, and rescuers knew they had to get to him probably in the next couple of hours, or that was it. And so another skinny man volunteered to go down into the hole, and they lowered him, and he would go all the way down to the bottom where Alfredo was. And he would call up that he found him and that Alfredo was alive. But Alfredo was stuck waist deep in this mud that the guy could not pull him out of. And so every time he'd begin to raise him slightly out of the mud, he'd lose his grip and he would fall back into the mud, going deeper into the mud each time. And after the 7th time of not being able to do it, Alfredo was getting dangerously close to being neck deep in the mud. And so the guy had to be pulled back out again. As soon as he was pulled back out again, more men volunteered themselves to go in there and try to yank him out, but many of them were not able to even get down to Alfredo. They would get stuck along the way. A couple did get to Alfredo, but they said his condition was worsening, he was weak, he wasn't even assisting trying to get pulled out. It was clear they were reaching the end. Finally, at 6:36 a.m. on Saturday, so 2.5 days after Alfredo fell in, they could not get him to respond on that two-way microphone. And so they sent down a sonar probe and they could not detect a heartbeat, and doctors declared him dead. The next day, liquid nitrogen was poured into the hole to preserve the body, and then 31 days later, they were finally able to extract it. After it was all over, the 25 million plus people that watched this take place live on television were crushed with what happened to Alfredo. There was a general sense that lots of people let this poor child down, which led to his death. But the person who was ultimately held accountable for it was the neighbor, who had illegally dug the well. And so the neighbor was charged with manslaughter and was sent to jail, but their sentence is not.
So walked over to say hello. But Marisa only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marisa over as it ran past her and ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared at the baseboard of the wall like there was something there. Marisa was totally annoyed by this cat, and as she looked over at it, she knew what it was doing, because lately Marisa had noticed there were clearly rats in her family's home, kind of scurrying around in the ceilings and the walls. Marisa could hear them all the time, and one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. And this totally stressed Marisa out. She'd actually begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication largely because of this rat infestation and really just the fact that Marisa hated living at her parents' home, but she didn't really have the means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem, and so she was just kind of stuck here. And so Marisa turned away from the cat and likely the rat behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen, and she gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. And then Marisa's mom offered her some food, but Marisa said, you know what, I'm not hungry, thank you. I'm just tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And so Marisa again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marisa's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day, but Marisa did not come downstairs, and so the parents assumed she must have left early for her job. Marisa was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marisa did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then because they figured, okay, well, maybe she left early and she came home from work early. And so we just kind of missed her on both ends. And that's why her door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early and she's in there and she wants to be left alone. After all, she's a 37-year-old woman. She probably wants her space. But later that night, when still the parents had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marisa's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marisa's mom opened the door and the room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned because they're thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning. We haven't seen her now. We don't know where she is. But again, their daughter is 37 years old. And if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now. And in the morning, they were sure to see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marisa, she had not come home, and now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marisa might have been kidnapped or something going to or coming back from work because Marisa was only 5 foot 3 inches tall and maybe 100 pounds, so she was really small. And so Marisa's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, your sister, she's missing. We don't know where she is. She might have gotten kidnapped. Come over and help us figure out what's going on. And so Gina came over to the house. And when she came inside, she told her parents, let's stay calm here. Marisa, she's 37. I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's some note or something from Marisa explaining where she is and what she's doing. And so the family searched the whole house, starting with Marisa's room, but they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what happened to Marisa. But they did eventually find Marisa's purse that was still in her room, and when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They're thinking, why would Marisa go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police and they reported Marisa missing. But the police got nowhere on the case. And so on November 9th, so 12 days after Marisa had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, the family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marissa's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marissa, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy. She was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina's thinking that it was totally possible that Marissa had just abruptly run away, or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. And so on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marissa's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marissa's room. And so Gina, she went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom, and she walked inside, and you gotta picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a human person. I mean, this room is totally packed with stuff. But Gina, she took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, kind of sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything in the room, and she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf, and she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd right in the middle of the shelf. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw it, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marissa Weber on October 28th, 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marissa had come home. She saw her mom and dad in the kitchen. She was offered food. She turned it down and said, "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." She went upstairs. She went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marissa grabbed a pill bottle next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, which are two very powerful painkillers. They're opiates, so highly addictive. She popped a few of those, and then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that. And then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed, getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marissa knew that the TV likely had become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marissa was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle loose the plug from the TV. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookcase that was pressed right up against the bureau. But this bookcase was so loaded down with books and things that Marissa had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marissa, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau and she reached back behind the 6-foot-tall bookcase and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug. But when she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny space behind the bookshelf and the wall, and she got pinned upside down. Now, we don't know why Marissa didn't begin calling out for help. Perhaps she was so under the influence of these drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten trapped upside down behind her bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. It causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head's going to explode. But the real problem is all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts your lungs and makes it really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so Marissa did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she didn't have the lung capacity to call out for help. And so likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marisa remained upside down behind this bookshelf and likely was aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention, and so eventually she died. Marisa's family would say when they were looking for Marisa in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they said they did hear sounds, but it sounded like the rats that were running all over their house, and so they didn't know it was actually likely Marisa moving around behind the bookcase trying to get their attention because she can't use her voice. And then after Marisa died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marisa decomposing, but the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy, and again, there are rats in this house. I mean, this was not a clean space, and so they kind of thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th, when Marisa's sister, Gina, was back in Marisa's bedroom, and she looked over at the bookcase, and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot right behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down, she realized it was her sister.
Our next story is called Digging Sounds.
On February 15th, 2004, two police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Murrow, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on this street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these two officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the two officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the two officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, "Hey, it's police, we're here to check on you." But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside. And when, again, they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property. And as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left. And it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the two officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, the owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend. And this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced, he was totally broke, he had loads of health issues like bad asthma, he had some liver issues, and just generally he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life, and now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So, on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up, she had not collected them, and so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall, he turned left into the bedroom, he opened up the closet, he went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking, but before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force. And suddenly, Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now, Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe, and as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days, that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells, but she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business,
But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't. And so when those two police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw two human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the two police officers rushed over, and together, they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there. He was deceased. His body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Mayor.
In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed mayor of a little village called Betterton in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton used to be this very fancy resort town on the water where people from Baltimore and Philadelphia would come there for vacations. They had fancy hotels and restaurants and shops. But by the time Monica became Betterton's mayor, Betterton had kind of gone downhill. People had stopped coming to Betterton. All the hotels shut down or were abandoned or burned down. The summer homes of the rich people from the big cities, those got sold off. And down at the beach, all these glamorous boardwalks literally just kind of crumbled into the sea. And in their place were all these shanty towns where homeless people set up their camps. But Monica had grown up in Betterton, and so she really loved the town and wanted to improve it. And so when she became mayor in 1979, she really leaned into her new role way more than other mayors would. Instead of managing the village from an office, like most mayors would do, Monica literally went out in town and just began doing lots of jobs around the town for free. She would ride around with the police and literally stop crimes in action. One time, she stumbled across someone looting a vacant hotel, and she personally got out, chased this person down, and made them put everything back that they had taken. She would pick up trash on the beach, she would do random repairs on people's homes and businesses all over town, and sometimes she would just go door to door asking people how they were doing. And so very quickly, the people of Betterton really grew to love Monica, and they loved seeing her every single day just out and about making Betterton a better place. And so, on March 20th, 1980, roughly 1 year into Monica's tenure as mayor, it was immediately noticeable to the people of Betterton when Monica was nowhere to be seen. That day, she did not go to the police station in the morning like she normally did. She was not seen at the beach doing her trash pickup, and she didn't knock on anybody's door. And so by mid-morning that day, the people of Betterton, all 120 of them, were basically out in force looking for Monica. And at 11:30 a.m., the police in Betterton got a call about Monica. It was this guy who was totally panicked. He could barely make a sentence. And he basically just told the police, you gotta get here now. And so the police hopped in their cars and they sped to the address this guy gave them. And when they got there, they saw it was this very plain, boxy building that was kind of tucked back in the woods. It was far away from the town center, and really nobody ever went over here. And the police, when they parked their cars, they saw the guy who had called the police, the distraught caller, was standing outside of the front door. He was obviously crying, and he was waving for them to come over and follow him into this building. And so the police got out of their cars, they ran over to this guy, and they're asking him, what happened? Where's Monica? What's going on? But this guy was so hysterical, he really could not describe what happened to Monica. He just kept telling them to come on, follow me. And so he led them into this building, and pretty quickly they entered this huge warehouse where all across the ceiling were these big metal catwalk areas that kind of zigged and zagged all over this warehouse. And below them, all over the floor, were these huge industrial-sized 15-foot tall vats that contained something. And so this guy who had led police here, he stops and he just points at the nearest vat. And so the police, picking up his cue, begin walking towards this vat. And as they got closer and closer, they were hit with this horrible smell that made them gag and cough. And before long, they had to stop and kind of compose themselves. The smell was so bad. It would turn out this building that was kind of removed from the town center of Betterton was Betterton's sewage treatment plant. And that morning, Monica had gone to the treatment plant to help clean some of these 15-foot tall industrial-sized vats that contained human waste. She had done this enough times that when she was here, she did not need any supervision. And so that morning, she was alone. She climbed up onto one of the catwalks over one of these big vats, and she had reached down with her testing kit to test the sewage to see how much cleaning it would need. And as she did that, she somehow slipped and fell into the big vat of human waste. Now, she would not have immediately gone under. It was not like a liquid. It was more like clay or really thick mud, where at first she would have kind of been laying on top of the sewage. But as soon as she tried to move to get out of the sewage would have functioned more like quicksand, where as soon as a part of her body went under the surface, it would not come up again. And so after the police composed themselves, they climbed up onto the catwalk and they looked down and they saw Monica, who was face down, partially submerged inside of this vat, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would reveal that she died of drowning, which means she literally inhaled human waste. On the morning of June 25th, 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store. And as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the backside of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning. And so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point. But he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly, Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground. And then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There were still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate, and he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't. And then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell just from the panicked look on Mike's face that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point, they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation. And then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, when are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here? And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale and his eyes were totally unfocused. And he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer. and they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out, and for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son, and so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. Then, when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia.
Our next story is called Fans.
In 2009, 25-year-old Larry Mario Moncada graduated from college and moved back in with his parents in Iowa. He was excited about his future, and his parents were extremely proud of him. As soon as Larry moved back home, the first thing he did was go out and get a placeholder job at the No Frills supermarket, which was a local supermarket right in town. He figured, you know what, it's temporary, but I don't want to just sit around all day. I want to do that until I find my career. But even though the job was supposed to be temporary, he found that he kind of loved the job because he loved the people he worked with, and his coworkers would later say that they loved working with him too. But everything in Larry and his family's life would get turned completely upside down in November of 2009. On November 26th, while a blizzard raged outside, Larry and his family celebrated Thanksgiving inside. After everyone was done eating, Larry told them that he actually had an overnight shift at the supermarket. And I don't think his family knew he had this shift. So they were like, oh man, do you really gotta go? The weather's so bad. And he's like, no, I gotta go. I don't mind. And they're like, all right, well, hey, sorry you gotta work. And Larry walks outside and goes to work. The next morning when he came back from that shift, his mother would say something seemed off about him. When he came inside, he was very disoriented. He didn't really know where he was. And his mom's trying to tell him that everything's okay. You know, what's going on? Did something happen out there? And this is when it dawned on her that he could be having an anxiety attack. Just a few years earlier, Larry had had a whole bunch of panic attacks and he was really struggling with anxiety. And it wasn't until his mom made him go to the doctor and put him on medication that he stabilized. But at this moment, she didn't know if her son was on any medication or not, so just to play it safe, she said, hey, let's go to the doctor and have you looked at. You don't seem well. So she brings him to the doctor, and the doctor quickly prescribes Larry an antidepressant. They go and fill the prescription, they go back home, and Larry takes one of these antidepressants. But the medication didn't seem to be doing anything because over the course of the day, Larry got progressively more and more stressed out and more confused seeming, and eventually he told his mom that he was hearing voices in his head that were telling him his heart is beating too quickly and he needs to eat sugar to slow down his heart. And his mom is looking at him thinking, what do I do about this? And so all she could think to do was just to stand next to him and kind of comfort him as he sits there eating sugar over the course of the day. Finally that night, he would fall asleep, and his mother prayed that over the course of the night that somehow this medication he had been prescribed would kick in and he would wake up and feel better, because so far, it really seemed to only be getting exponentially worse. But the next morning when Larry got up, he was just as bad as the night before, except now he was having these vivid hallucinations. He said there were people in the house that were looking for him, and so he spent the day running around the house, hiding from people in the house that were not actually there. Then finally that night, Larry just kind of loses it and begins screaming at his parents and berating them before suddenly running out the front door without shoes, without a jacket, no wallet, no cell phone, no anything. And he just runs directly into the blizzard and disappears. His family was so caught off guard by this happening that it took them a minute to get out the front door after him, but it was snowing so hard they could barely see in front of their face and they knew he was gone. So immediately they call the police, but the police have the same issue. They can't really go looking for him right now because the visibility was so bad. And so they told his family that we can't really start until tomorrow morning, so hopefully he turns up tonight. So the next day, when the weather clears up a little bit, the police go out looking for Larry, and they're asking people in town if they've seen him, and no one's seen Larry. And unfortunately, because it had snowed so much the night before, any of Larry's tracks leading out of Larry's house were now covered over. And so after a couple of days of this, when there's just no sign of this guy, the police say to the family, look, there's not much we can do. We're just going to have to wait to see if he turns up. 10 years later, the No Frills supermarket where Larry used to work was out of business and it was about to get torn down, and some contractors were sent in to start ripping down the shelving and breaking down the inside of the building. And when they went into the back and began pulling away those huge freezers that keep your milk and your dairy products in, they start pulling those away from the wall. Larry's body comes tumbling out. It had been pinned in this tiny 18-inch wide space between the back of the freezer and the wall. It's believed on the night Larry ran out of his parents' house barefoot into a blizzard, he ran right up the road and went to the No Frills supermarket. Now, it was closed at the time, but he had access to the back door with the key code because he worked there. And so he went inside and he climbed on top of the freezers, the section of the freezers that jut back into the space that no one in the store can see. And he climbed on top because on top of there, all the workers would kind of congregate up there. It was like a little clubhouse where the workers would avoid the managers for little pockets of the day. And so Larry probably climbed up there because it represented a really happy place for him. And when he got up there, he must have somehow tripped and fallen into the tiny 18-inch space between the freezer and the wall. Investigators believe there's no way he actually got hurt when he fell into this little space. He got wedged in there, but he wasn't harmed. The problem was these huge fans that run constantly to keep the freezer cold were unbelievably loud and would have completely drowned out his cries for help. And so no one knows for sure how long this took, but eventually he would die because no one heard him. Looking back at old Facebook posts around the time that Larry would have been dead behind the freezer, there was a whole bunch of people that were commenting on Facebook that they didn't want to shop at the No Frills supermarket anymore. Apparently there was a really bad smell coming out of the back freezer.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Blue Door.
On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain, and so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it, but despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse, she was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's got to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home. And the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second, and then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you? And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas. And they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help.
In order to explain what happened next, you have to have a basic understanding of the layout of this building, specifically the outside of it. If you were outside looking at this building, you would see an enclosed staircase that runs from the bottom to the top of the building, with outdoor landings on each floor.
The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor, and she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you gotta remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, and a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, "Hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out." And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally, on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million. By the beginning of 2016, everybody who lived in apartment building number 12 on Shanxi Road in the big Chinese city of Xi'an knew to stay away from the woman who lived at the end of the hall on the 15th floor. Now, they didn't know much about this woman, but what they did know about her was totally bizarre and kind of alarming.
The woman, whose family name was Wu, but nobody actually knew this woman's individual name, was 43 years old and she lived alone. And from what residents could tell, nobody ever came to visit her and she almost never left her apartment. But oftentimes, residents on the 15th floor could hear this woman talking to herself very animatedly inside of her apartment, and sometimes she'd even get into these big arguments with herself where it was clear she was kind of playing the role of multiple personalities at once. But none of these things were the reason why people avoided her altogether. They avoided her because she seemed really dangerous. One day, a few months earlier, a teenage girl was walking down the hallway on the 15th floor, making her way towards her friend's apartment, when she passed by this woman's apartment door. And as soon as she walked past, the door to this woman's apartment flew open, and the woman rushed outside and began screaming incoherently. And so this teenage girl, she whips around and sees this woman, and instinctively, what this girl thought was, oh my goodness, this woman is being attacked. She's running away from somebody in her apartment or something. But then very quickly, it became apparent that this woman was not being attacked. She was attacking the teenage girl. So this woman, she looks at the girl and her eyes go wide and she kind of curls her hands into claws. And then she began running down the hall towards this girl. And so the girl, she begins to scream and she turns and she runs down the hall and she manages to pound on her friend's door. And her friend happened to be right behind the door. They opened it up, the girl ran inside, and they shut and locked the door right as this woman came barreling into the door. And this behavior from this woman on the 15th floor was just the beginning. Following this first attack, the woman on the 15th floor would routinely barge out of her apartment and chase down young women and teenage girls that were walking past her door. Now, this woman never actually hurt anyone that she chased down and even reached in time. She just kind of scared them. And so as a result, the residents of this apartment building, including the women and young girls who had been attacked by this woman, their reaction to this was not anger or resentment or, some desire to go call the police and have this woman arrested. Instead, the residents of this building just kind of felt bad for this woman. It seemed very obvious that she was mentally unwell and probably very lonely, and so they kind of collectively decided to not call the police and instead just kind of ignore her. But sometime in early February, this woman's random attacks on young women and girls just kind of stopped. And at first, residents, especially of the 15th floor of this apartment building, were just relieved because all of a sudden you could walk down that hallway in peace again. But by the end of February, it dawned on people who lived in this apartment building that not only had this woman stopped her random attacks, but also now they couldn't even hear her inside of her apartment talking to herself because that was something people always heard, and now her apartment was totally silent. And so pretty quickly, people became kind of worried about this woman. But nobody was willing to go knock on her door and actually make sure she was okay, because again, this woman was viewed as being kind of dangerous. I mean, she was literally jumping out of her apartment and attacking random passerbys, and so people just continued to keep their distance from this woman. And so as people did that, they began to tell themselves that, probably she just moved out without anybody noticing, and that's why she's gone quiet. But it would turn out that was not the case. Right around the time the woman on the 15th floor stopped her attacks and went silent, sometime in early February, an elevator inside of this apartment building broke down between floors 11 and 10. And so a maintenance crew was called out to fix the elevator, but when they got there, they realized they didn't have the supplies or the manpower to actually make the fix, and so a decision was made to just cut the power to this individual elevator car, and then the work crew said they'd come back in about a month when they had the right supplies and people. And sure enough, a month later, this crew came back with what they needed, and they were able to lower the broken elevator car down to floor 10, and then they opened up the doors, and they were absolutely horrified at what they saw inside of that car. It's believed that shortly after this woman on the 15th floor had one of her outbreaks and chased someone down the hall, she got into the elevator and began traveling down. And when the elevator car got between floors 11 and 10, it came to a lurching stop. But for some reason, when this happened,
The woman did nothing. She didn't yell for help, she didn't scream, she didn't pound on the doors, she didn't press any buttons. She just sat in the elevator car in absolute silence. And so eventually it was discovered that one of the elevator cars in this apartment building was broken, not because the woman had called out, but probably because someone had tried to hail the elevator and it didn't come down. And so that maintenance crew was called out, but they couldn't make the repair, and so they decided to cut the power to that car and come back in a month. Now, this elevator crew had no idea there was anybody inside the elevator car because, again, this woman who was trapped in there was totally silent throughout their attempts to try to fix the car. And so after these workers cut the power to this elevator car and left, this woman was doomed. This woman just sat in silence in this elevator car with no food and no water for several days until she died of dehydration, which is one of the most agonizing and slow ways to go. Now, at some point, this woman did attempt to free herself because there were scratch marks inside the elevator indicating that she had tried to claw her way out, and her hands were totally mutilated, suggesting she really had been clawing pretty hard, but that was the only time she tried to save herself. Otherwise, she just sat there and eventually died.
Our next story is called Rabbit Hole. On January 1st, 2015, a family in South Yorkshire, England, gathered at a restaurant for their annual New Year's Day lunch. But one member of this family who said they would be attending didn't show up. It was 50-year-old Stephen Winfrey, who was an unemployed, divorced father of two, who in recent years had become quite depressed. When they reached out to him on his phone and he didn't pick up, the family pretty quickly started to worry that something could have happened to him, that, perhaps he did something to harm himself given his mental state. But his sister, Nadine, who was at this lunch, she reassured the rest of the family that she had spoken to Stephen the night before, and he was in great spirits and had told her that his plan was to go rabbit hunting the next day on New Year's Day before heading over to the restaurant for lunch. And because Nadine knew that her brother recently had really taken a liking to rabbit hunting, it was one of the very few things that actually made him happy, she told the family, look, I bet you anything he just lost track of time and he will get here late, or maybe we won't see him at all, but at least he's out doing something that makes him happy. And so the family was reassured by this, and so they sat down at their table, they ordered their food, and the whole meal, everyone's kind of looking over at the front door, expecting Stephen to come strolling in at any minute. But when they finished up eating, he still had not arrived. And so as the family was getting ready to leave the restaurant and head back home, they all decided that, you know what, I'm sure Stephen is fine, he's doing something he loves, I'm sure he did just get carried away, and so we'll just wait for him to contact us. And so the family, they all leave the restaurant and they spend the rest of the day at their respective households. And then the following morning, they all get in touch with each other and they discover that still no one has seen or heard from Stephen. And so at this point, the family just felt like there was something off about this. And so they contacted the police and they reported him missing. As the police were getting ready to head out and begin looking for Stephen that day, they received a call. Stephen had been found. Although the exact details of what happened to Stephen may never be fully understood, this is the best theory that the police have come up with. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the day Stephen was supposed to meet his family for lunch, he had gotten up early and headed out to a nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he told his sister he would be. He had gone to the park with his dog and some ferrets. The way Stephen caught rabbits is he would release these ferrets into various rabbit holes, and then he would stand back with his rifle and he would wait for the ferret to run the rabbits out of their holes, out into the open, and then he would raise his rifle and shoot at the rabbits, and then his dog would run over and grab the rabbit and bring it back to him. And so all morning long, he was doing this with relative success, And then something happened to where Stephen decided he needed to actually look inside of one of these rabbit holes. Perhaps one of his ferrets got stuck or one of the rabbits got stuck, but either way, he wanted to look into the opening of one of these rabbit holes. And so he walked over to it, and apparently he couldn't quite see whatever it was he wanted to see. And so he got down on his hands and knees and stuck his head into this rabbit hole opening. Now, these openings to these rabbit holes are pretty narrow, and so once he forced his head inside, it got stuck. He could not pull it out again. And so all around the outside of this hole where his head was stuck, there were these deep divots that his hands had obviously dug once he realized he was stuck, because he was trying to dig the entrance a little bit wider to get his head out. But as he was working really, really hard and laboring to kind of dig this hole out, he was burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was inside of this hole. And so very quickly, as he was trying to save himself, he would have started to struggle breathing because there just wasn't enough air in this hole. And so when it became clear he was starting to suffocate, he abandoned the approach of trying to dig himself out and began trying to contort his body outside of the hole at really extreme angles to try to pop his head out, even if it meant breaking his neck in the process. But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not get his head out. The following day, January 2nd at 4 p.m., this is after Stephen has been reported missing, a person walking through that forested park, they found Stephen. They saw his body poking out of that hole at a really extreme angle, and so they called the police. The police showed up to the park, and they confirmed that Stephen was dead. He had suffocated. His death was not ruled a suicide. It was determined to be an accident. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found near his body, and they were unhurt. The next and final story of today's episode is called My Brother's Keeper.
Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors, or police officers, or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed. And then finally at 2 a.m., he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact There were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the two brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off, but instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them. And when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door, and pretty quickly the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the second floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the second floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the second floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling in trash, Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere, and lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn, where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster, and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead body.
On January 23rd, 1989, a mother was cooking dinner in her home in Rochester, New York, when her 11-year-old daughter came into the kitchen. The daughter had just finished delivering newspapers along her delivery route in their quiet suburban neighborhood, and so her mother asked her the same nightly question, "How was the route?" And usually, the daughter replied with just a, "Good." But tonight was different. Instead, her daughter said, "It's okay." And the mother pried, like, "Well, what do you mean? What happened?" And the daughter said, "Well, I saw something strange." She told her mom that she delivered newspapers to this one particular old man. He was very nice and he always waved to her whenever she went by, and tonight was no different. He had waved to her, but there was just something off about the way he was sitting. The mother asked, what do you mean? And the daughter, she really struggled to articulate what she had seen. One, it was dark. Two, the man was sitting inside of a screened-in porch that kind of obscured her view, and the awnings were pretty low, making it hard to look in. But she said basically when she had gone past, the man had waved to her like normal, but his legs appeared to be straight up in the air, like he was sitting on a chair and his legs were like up, vertical, right in front of him. In fact, when he waved, it was like he was waving between his legs at her. And so when the mother heard this, she really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, the story didn't make any sense. She couldn't really understand how this guy was sitting where his legs would be straight up in the air like that. But at the same time, she could tell her daughter was worried and, she kind of figured that maybe her daughter's imagination had run wild here. And so she told her daughter, like, "Hey, look, if he waved to you, then I'm sure everything is just fine. Don't worry about it." But the following night, when the girl came back from her route once again, she was even more upset about this guy out on his porch. She told her mom that once again, she looked in the porch and there he was sitting there with his legs straight up in the air, except this time he didn't wave to her, including when she made a point to stop and wave at him. He did not wave back. Now, the girl told her mom that she was worried about him, and so she went right up to the door to go check on him, but the screened-in porch was locked, so she couldn't get inside, and, her view was kind of obscured because of the screen, so she couldn't really see him in there, but, she didn't know what to do, so she just left. Now, this story, which was already weird, now did seem a whole lot weirder that 2 days in a row, her daughter is seeing this. But the mother's thinking to herself, like, come on, this is just some older guy who loves this chair and, he's fallen asleep in some weird position here. And, my daughter is sort of exaggerating what she's seeing. Like, this can't be a big deal here. But again, seeing the concern on her daughter's face, she told her daughter, "Look, don't worry about it. I'm sure everything's fine. I will go by tomorrow morning and make sure he's okay." So the next morning, a little before 11 a.m., the mother arrived on the street where this old man lived. And as she was walking down the road towards the house, she actually spotted the mailman. And so before she went any farther, she flagged the mailman down and she asked him, like, "Hey, is there anything weird going on with that old guy who lives right over there?" But the mailman was like, "No, he's just a nice older guy who waves at everybody who goes by." And so the mother thanked the mailman and did give some thought to just, taking what the mailman said and turning back around and heading home and telling her daughter everything's fine. But, she knew her daughter was really worried about this guy. And so she decided she would just continue down the road and check on this guy for herself and just really make sure he's okay and then report back to her daughter. And also the mother was thinking, it's about 20 degrees outside. It's very cold. This is not really a good time for an older man to be outside so much. So what's he doing? Like, let's really make sure he's okay. And so the mother made her way down the road and she reached the old man's house. And sure enough, the screened-in porch really did obscure, whoever was inside of it. She could see a silhouette of what appeared to be this old man sitting there. But the first thing she actually noticed was not him, but rather the 2 newspapers that were sitting right on his walkway, uncollected. I mean, these are the newspapers that her daughter had left over the same period of time that she's seeing this weird thing happening with this guy. And so suddenly the woman's feeling like that's a pretty big red flag. And so she hustled her way right up towards the front. And as she did, she looked into the screen porch and waved at this old man to try to get his attention, like, hey, are you okay in there? But the man did not wave back. And so the mother went right up to the door and she checked it, but like her daughter had said, it was locked. And so the mother, she pressed her face up against the mesh screen that kind of had been obscuring her view from a distance. And she put her face right up against the screen where she would have a clear view inside. And when she did, and she saw the old man who was in fact right there, and he did in fact have his legs up, when she saw him, she realized what was actually going on. And the second she did, she jumped back, turned around, and ran away to go call the police. It would turn out the old man who lived there, whose name was Robert Ham, and he was 73 years old, he was not just eccentric and sitting weirdly on his front porch. Instead, on January 23rd, right before that little girl had come home and told her mother that this man had been acting strangely, on that evening, Robert had come out onto his screened-in porch, and for whatever reason, he had attempted to sit down on this trash can that was out there on the porch. But the lid didn't hold. And so Robert fell butt first into this trash can, folding him up into this V position where his legs were straight up in front of him. And Robert was too weak to get himself out of the trash can. And also because of being in this V position where his legs were pressed up against his torso, it was restricting his ability to breathe and to make any sound. And so all he could do in this position was just wave at passerby, hoping they would see he was in trouble and go help him. But unfortunately, nobody could really tell what he was doing, including the little girl on the paper route. They just thought there was this guy sitting in his porch in this weird position, waving to people, when in reality, he was dying. And so unfortunately, because nobody came to his aid, Robert did die. He would die of a heart attack, and in fact, by the time that little girl's mother arrived at his house and put her face up against the screen, Robert was already dead. Our next story is called Lookout.
On July 10, 1941, a brand new British submarine was commissioned called HMS Umpire. 9 days later, on July 19th, the submarine and her crew were told to meet up with a convoy moving north along the Medway River in England and make their way to Scotland. So Umpire joined up with the convoy, but then they started having engine problems that night, and they began drifting back behind the convoy until they were basically not in the convoy anymore at all. During this time, the commander of the submarine was up in the bridge, which is the area that controls the submarine when it's above surface, just above the wing. The captain of the Umpire was concerned this convoy would not see them when they came through because they were a submarine, so they're sitting low in the water and they're already all dark. They have no lights on the outside on purpose because this was during World War II and they didn't want German ships or planes to spot them. And because of their engine problems, they had drifted away from their convoy, which would have been protection. So the captain decides to deviate from their course to get the submarine clearly out of the way of this convoy. And so when he started turning the submarine, the steering broke, leaving the submarine now turned so its entire side is now facing this convoy, and they were still drifting directly towards this convoy. And so sure enough, before the captain could do anything, one of the larger ships struck the side of the submarine, immediately flooding their forward torpedo room. And for a brief second, the submarine and the ship were kind of mangled together, and then it slipped off the ship and it sunk all the way to the bottom, 18 meters down. The captain, along with the other 3 men that were up on the bridge with him when they were struck, they managed to leap out at the last second and were treading water when this all happened. As for the other 34 crew members, they were stuck inside when it sunk. A number of the crew had been sleeping at the time of the crash, and so all they felt was this crash, the power goes out, they leap out of their beds, and they're landing in waist-deep water, and they're running out into the halls kind of fumbling around because they can't see anything, and all they can hear is the sound of water pouring inside of their submarine. And so these sailors had gone through all sorts of drills to prepare for this type of scenario where, power's out and you're sinking, and so they know by touch how to get to the one area that has an escape hatch, which is the engine room. And after 20 of them got inside the engine room, the water levels in the hallway were getting so high that it was spilling into that room. And it was getting to the point where if they didn't seal the door, they were going to flood this one room that was their only chance of survival. And so they had to make the heartbreaking decision to lock and seal that door, meaning the 14 other sailors on the other side, if they hadn't already died, were now condemned. But for the 20 men who now were going to be able to use this escape hatch, there was no guarantee that would work. Because to use the escape hatch on a submarine, you need to understand how it works. You can't just open a hatch on a submarine. It won't open. The pressure from the seawater presses down on it to where it literally cannot open. You might be able to open it a crack if you use a tool, but that's about it. In order to open the escape hatch, you need to use something called a lockout chamber. And so a lockout chamber is like this really tight claustrophobia-inducing thing that looks an awful lot like a gas chamber, where you step through one hatch and you shut it and you seal it so it's watertight, and then above you is your escape hatch. But you can't open it until the pressure inside of the chamber has been equalized. And the way they do that is they flood the inside of the chamber the escapee is in. And so you're standing inside of this tight space, totally sealed in, and there's a control panel inside the chamber itself and also inside the sub, if you're lucky enough to have someone do that for you. You turn on the chamber, at which point water is dumped inside of this tight space you're in until it's completely full and you're holding your breath, at which point you've now equalized. The pressure inside the chamber is equal to that outside, and you can actually open the hatch. So the person inside on a breath hold undoes the hatch, opens it up, and then hopefully your swim isn't too far because you're already on a breath hold, and you swim to the surface. And during World War II, submariners were outfitted with a special piece of equipment if they ever needed to leave via the escape hatch, and it was their Davis escape gear, which is basically this life jacket that's uninflated, and when you manually activate it, it suddenly inflates, and so when you go through that hatch, you would activate it, and it would assist you to get to the surface. And so after those 20 sailors had decided to seal off the engine room, they immediately shifted focus and began getting guys into the escape hatch. And one of their most junior sailors, a guy by the name of Killian, said he would stay inside the room and operate the control panel so everybody else had the best chance of getting out of the escape hatch. And so sure enough, he put all 19 into the hatch and he got them out of the submarine. And then he, on his own, had to get in the hatch, seal it himself, and control the panel in total darkness, flood the space, open it up, and shoot to the surface. He would live, and he would be awarded the British Empire Medal for bravery. One junior officer named Edward Jones was one of the 14 men that did not get to the engine room before they sealed it off. And when he got there and realized the situation, he turned around and looked down the hall, and there were only 3 other men that were standing there. And he didn't know how many had made it in the engine room. He figured this was the only 4 that had not made the cut. But in fact, there was actually 10 other people that were just stuck in various places inside of the submarine. But Jones decided he only had these guys in front of him, and so he said, "Hey, come with me, I have an idea." As Jones led them down this hallway, the water levels had risen up to their necks, and all these circuits on the walls were starting to spark all around them. And so Jones led them to the middle of the submarine, and then he turned and went up into the control room, and then from the control room, he went even farther up into what's called the conning tower. The conning tower is a submarine's main attack center. It's where you have those periscopes they look around in, and it also has the firing buttons for their torpedoes. It is not designed to be an escape hatch, because once you flood the conning tower, there's no control panel like there is on an escape hatch to drain the water that was used to equalize in order to open the hatch. So once the water's in, it's either you get to the surface or you drown. Also, in order to exit out of the conning tower, you need to go through this very narrow tube that goes straight up, and it's got a ladder through it that can barely fit one person climbing up, meaning the people at the bottom of the ladder will have to hold their breath a lot longer than the people at the top. So Jones and the other 3 sailors, they get to the conning tower and they seal the hatch at their feet, so blocking the hallway flood from coming into where they are. And they realize that even though they have to do this, there are no other alternatives here, that realistically 1 or 2 or more are going to die in the process of just trying to get out of the submarine. But it was all they could do, so they made peace with their decision. They climbed up and they opened the hatch just enough to let water come in, but quite a bit started coming in. The men wedged themselves as high up in the tunnel as they possibly could, but obviously not everybody could get all the way up to the hatch. And so 2 were down low, and Edward Jones and 1 other were up towards the top. And Jones would say that at first they were talking and praying, and then when they started feeling the water get closer and closer to their heads, they went silent. And then Jones remembers keeping his hand on the one man that was below him, and when his hand was wet, he knew the 2 men below him were completely submerged, and then the water came up to his face, covered his head, and at that point he opened it up and they swam out. Of the 4 men in the conning tower, only Edward Jones and the other guy who was high up in the tunnel with him made it to the surface. All told, only 14 of the 38 total crew survived the accident.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Wrong Button.
At 8:30 p.m. on August 20th, 2010, a 76-year-old man named Zhang walked through the streets of New Taipei City, which is a major city in northern Taiwan. Zhang was on the end of an evening walk, and he was making his way back towards his daughter's apartment, where he was also staying. And as Zhang neared the apartment, he happened to notice there was a street lamp right outside with this big poster attached to it that he hadn't seen before. And as he got closer, he saw there was also this picture of this middle-aged woman whose name was Chun Yan Chui, and apparently she was missing. And not only that, she also lived in the same building that his daughter lived in. Except Chun was actually a dementia patient, and she was staying on the 5th floor of this apartment building complex where there was this memory care facility, and that's where she was being taken care of. And about a week earlier, she had gone out for an evening walk, this is what it said on the poster, and just not returned. And so since the week before, police had been out looking for her and her family and friends. They were putting these posters up, and it was clear, nobody had found her yet. Now, Zhang had never met this woman, but he sort of felt bad for her. And so he found himself staring at this picture and trying to memorize her face, in the off chance that he just saw her somewhere. He could report her to the authorities and hopefully get her rescued. And so after staring at the picture for a little bit longer and sort of feeling bad for this woman, Zhang turned and just continued inside the apartment building. And once he was in the apartment building, he made his way over to the elevator, he hit the up button, and he waited, and then a moment later, there was a ding and the doors opened up. He stepped onto the elevator, he pressed the button, the doors closed, and then Zhang waited as he headed up to his daughter's apartment on the 7th floor. But as he was going up, he noticed he had accidentally hit the 6th floor, not the 7th floor. And right at that moment, he saw that he was reaching the 6th floor, and so the elevator car was slowing down. And so he just was like, oh, whoops, and he hit floor 7. But by the time he hit floor 7, the car had come to a stop on floor 6, and the doors were opening. Like it would need to reset. Doors open on 6, they close, and then he'd go to 7. Like this is no big deal. And so Zhang is just waiting, for these doors to open, shut, and go up one more floor. However, when the doors opened on floor 6, Zhang is looking straight out, and he could not believe what he saw, and he just began to scream. Around the same time this was happening, Zhang's daughter was finishing up her shift at work when she got a phone call. And she saw it was coming from her dad, and he rarely called her when she was at work. So this was sort of confusing and surprising. And so right away she picked it up and she answered, and immediately she hears her dad screaming incoherently. He's obviously terrified, and all Zhang's daughter can hear is that her dad is saying he's trapped in an elevator and he doesn't know what to do. And so, Zhang's daughter is getting scared just based on what her dad sounds like. She doesn't really know what's going on, but she told her dad, like, okay, I'll call the building. We'll get you some help. Like, stay calm. You're going to be okay. But her dad just continued rambling and he was totally incoherent. And eventually, Zhang's daughter just said, okay, dad, like, just hang tight. I'm going to get you some help. And then she hung up, and then she immediately called her apartment building's administration and emergency services line and told them, hey, I think my dad is stuck on one of your elevator cars. He's really upset. Can you please help him? And after getting the emergency services to, get spun up into action to go save her dad, Zhang's daughter left work, hopped in her car, and began rushing home. It would take Zhang's daughter about 40 minutes to get back to her apartment. And by the time she got there, she fully expected her dad would be safely out of the elevator. I mean, he was obviously very upset, but she had called the building. They were on it. They were going to get him out. But When she went inside the lobby of the apartment building, she saw a crowd of police officers just standing there. She didn't see her dad anywhere. And before she could even ask any questions, she noticed one of the officers was on the phone. And clearly, just based on what was being said by this officer, he was talking to her father. Like he was talking to somebody who was hysterical, and this officer was doing his best to try to calm him down and sort of talk him through what was happening. And so Zhang's daughter immediately walks up to this officer and says, hey, I'm his daughter, the guy who's stuck in the elevator, I'm his daughter. What's going on? I would have figured he'd be out by now. What's happened? At this point, one of the officers confirms that, this really is this man's daughter, and he pulls her aside and he explains to her that, yes, your dad is still in the elevator because we can't get him out. The reality is this is not a normal situation here. He's trapped in there, and really the only way for him to get out is for him to do something really specific. Like us and the building staff, we can't do anything. He has to do this one really specific thing, and right now he's refusing to do it. He's too panicked, he's too scared. We're trying to calm him down, but it's not working. And so Zhang's daughter asked this officer, can you please explain to me what you're talking about? What is this specific thing you want him to do? I don't get it. And at that point, the officer kind of composed himself and explained to the daughter, what was really going on inside of that elevator car. And after Zhang's daughter heard it, she was horrified, and she immediately understood why her dad was so upset and unwilling to do this one particular thing that would save him, but would be pretty awful. She got it, but she knew she would have to hop on the phone and convince her dad that he had to do it, there was no other way. And so she walked over to the officer who was on the phone with her dad. She took the phone and she began talking her dad through, what he really needed to do here. She basically gave him a pep talk and said, Dad, for me, you got to find the strength and do this thing and get out of there. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, the elevator doors in the lobby chimed and opened up, and Zhang came stumbling out. He looked horrible, disheveled, but he was okay. And right away, police officers rushed towards him, but they bypassed him and went into the elevator and immediately surrounded something in the elevator car. It would turn out that missing woman, Chen Yanchui, the woman who was on that poster that Zhang saw before he walked into the apartment building, well, she really had gone missing a week earlier on her evening walk. But everybody thought she got lost while she was on that walk because she was a dementia patient, and so, she had memory issues. But the reality was, she actually did come back to her apartment. However, when she got on the elevator, she actually made the same mistake that Zhang did. Now, she was not trying to get to the 7th floor, she was trying to get to the 5th floor, but she accidentally pressed the 6th floor. So up she goes, she gets to the 6th floor, the doors open up, she steps off the elevator car, and she's immediately completely confused. And for what it's worth, it didn't matter that she had dementia. Anybody who got off on the 6th floor would likely be confused if you had never been to this building before. Because the 6th floor was actually a private residence, and the person who lived on that floor was so worried about people breaking into their private residence that they had installed a metal gate in front of the elevator doors. And so unless you had the key to get through this gate, when you got off on the 6th floor, you basically would step onto a little platform that basically is the hallway leading into the 6th floor, and then you'd be hit with the gate. And so that's exactly what happened to Chun. She got off on the 6th floor, maybe thinking this is the 5th floor. She stepped onto that little narrow strip that you could actually stand on the 6th floor before you reached the gate. And then as she was trying to figure out, where am I? This isn't the 5th floor. This doesn't make any sense. There's a gate in front of me. The doors to the elevator closed. And she had no way to open them up again because the buttons to access the elevator were beyond the gate. And so suddenly Chun is standing in this narrow space, the doors have closed behind her, and she can't do anything. She's trapped between the gate and the elevator doors. And even though people are using this elevator right behind her, the only person who would come to the 6th floor is the owner of that residence, and they were on vacation. And so for days and days, Chun is just trapped basically in between the gate and the elevator with no one having any idea she was there. She's calling out, she's doing everything she can to get somebody's attention, but nobody can hear her. And after 5 days of this, when the owner of this residence didn't come home because they were on vacation, she eventually died because she didn't have food or water or anything. She was just standing there for 5 days. And then a couple of days later, Jong accidentally rides to the 6th floor. He's like, oh shoot, I need to go to 7. He hits 7, but the doors open on 6. And when they do, Chun's body, which had been basically frozen in this standing position, fell backwards onto him, pinned him to the ground. He starts screaming and freaking out. He gets out from underneath her, but her body, which was in rigor mortis at this point, is stiff, and she was lying like a board on the ground with her feet jutting out onto the 6th floor and her upper half inside of the elevator, and so she was blocking the doors from closing. And so Jong is freaking out. He's calling his daughter. He can't believe this. There's this dead person in here. And eventually police get involved and they tell Jong, you just gotta move the body so the doors will close. But again, her body is heavy and it's stiff and she's obviously deceased. She's starting to decompose. And Jong basically couldn't handle it and he was unwilling to move her body until his daughter hopped on the phone and said, you gotta do it. At which point, he managed to lift her up, get her out of the way, and kind of push her off to the side of the elevator car. He rode down to the bottom, at which point the police came in and handled the situation. Now, the owner of the 6th floor residence was not held criminally responsible, despite putting that gate up that created this trap that killed Chun. However, despite that, he would end up paying Chun's family about $97,000 equivalent just to compensate for her death. Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Today's podcast features 3 stories that involve people who got trapped with no way out. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called A Crush on a Cruise, and it's about a cruise ship's very unexpected catastrophe. The second story you'll hear is called The Gauge, and it's about a critical error that leads to a horrifying fate for several saturation divers. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Teapot, and it's about a freak accident turning a vacation into a nightmare. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and open up all of their cereal. And make sure when you do this, you open the bag up really messily and you tear down the side.
Just after 6 p.m. on December 27th, 2015, a woman named Sarah Robinson was getting ready inside of her cabin on the 7th floor of a massive cruise ship. She and her boyfriend were going to dinner that night with Sarah's parents in one of the restaurants on board the ship. And in fact, this entire trip, this whole vacation, was actually a big gift from Sarah's parents to Sarah and her boyfriend. And so far, the trip had been totally amazing. I mean, all 4 of them, Sarah, her boyfriend, and Sarah's parents, had got to go swimming and drink great drinks and have great food, and it was just like a total dream. But now they only had 1 night left, tonight, and they wanted to make the most of it. And their plan was to go to the big buffet that the ship offered and just totally indulge on the amazing food and just have some laughs, share stories, and then the next day they'd wake up in the Florida port that they left from, and the trip would be over. But for now, they had this 1 dinner left. And so, after Sarah and her boyfriend were all ready, they left their cabin and they met Sarah's parents out in the hallway, and then Sarah led the way towards the stairwell that would bring them up to the 10th floor where the restaurant was that they were going to. Once they reached the 10th floor, Sarah could see right in front of her the entrance to this restaurant. And so she, her boyfriend, and her parents, all behind her, began walking towards the restaurant. And to get there, they would have to walk past this sort of lobby right in front of the restaurant, where there was this elevator bank that would go down to the lobby and all the other floors. And so, Sarah and her family, they walked past these elevators, and as they did, Sarah began to hear what sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. But that didn't make any sense because that whole day the weather had been beautiful and clear, and Sarah, when she heard this sound, she instinctively kind of looked around the corner out one of the windows, and she looked out into the night, and it was still clear and beautiful out. So this could not be rain. And so Sarah, she turned around and she looked at her boyfriend and her parents with a sort of quizzical look, being like, do you hear this? Like, what is that sound? And they clearly had heard it too, and were looking back at her like, I don't know. But before they could even start to discuss whatever this was, a woman who they didn't know, who was standing near these elevators as well, began to scream. It would turn out, just a few minutes before this woman began to scream, the cruise ship's chief electrician, 66-year-old Jose Sandoval Opazo, had begun doing routine maintenance on the elevators that were located a few floors below the 10th floor, but still within that same elevator bank that could bring you up to the 10th floor where that restaurant was. And while Jose was performing this very routine and quick maintenance on the elevator, something strange happened. But to understand why this happened, you need to understand a little bit about Jose and the other electricians on board this cruise ship. So there was oftentimes a lot of very quick and easy maintenance that would need to get done on these elevators, which would involve going into the elevator shaft to do it. But again, these are very short bursts, in and out, very easy to do. All the electricians know how to do it. And the procedure was to actually fully shut down that elevator, like completely, and then go inside and do the maintenance, and then go through the process of starting the elevator all over again. But that was so disruptive to the flow of traffic on the ship each day, and it was just kind of a hassle. And so Jose and the other electricians had come up with this sort of workaround that didn't require them to shut down the elevator, because again, that was just a huge pain and they didn't want to do it. And so what they would do is they would wait until the elevator car within the shaft they needed to do maintenance on was at some other level, like on floor 2, and they would go into the elevator on like floor 8, and then quickly do the maintenance on the inside of the shaft or whatever it is they had to do. Or sometimes they would actually have to do repairs on the elevator car itself, in which case they would just kind of go in real quick, do the repairs, get out again. But all of it was predicated on just kind of knowing where the elevator car was in the shaft and being really quick, in and out. And so Jose and the other electricians had done this many times and there was no issues. But on this day, Jose, he got into the elevator shaft to make these simple repairs. And so he actually was standing inside of the shaft on top of the elevator car that was down, a few levels down from 10. And he began making these repairs. And suddenly the car lurched into action because a guest unknowingly had walked into the elevator car and pressed floor 10. And so Jose is on this elevator car that starts moving, and before he can even figure out what's going on, the little opening that he used, the kind of service entrance into the shaft, had been covered up by the elevator car. And so his exit was now gone, and he was now relatively slowly moving up the shaft. Now, Jose would have no idea when this car was going to stop, but if it went to the top, he'd get crushed, and he knew it. And so in kind of a moment of panic, Jose attempted to step to the side to somehow go between the wall and the elevator. It was like he had nowhere to go and he knew it and he just took that path. But there was an inch of space between the wall and the car. And so the second he did that, the car kept going and it sucked him down into that space and just destroyed him. And so by the time this elevator car reached its destination, the 10th floor, and that guest got off the elevator car, by this point, Jose's body had been totally destroyed and all of his blood was dripping down the elevator shaft, splattering into the walls and hitting the ground, and it sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. And so that's what Sarah and her family were hearing. And then the reason that woman started screaming is she was the first one who turned and saw all this blood coming down the front of the elevator doors. Medics would arrive quickly on the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Jose was deceased.
Our next story is called The Gauge.
Around 10 p.m. on September 9, 1975, a 24-year-old man named Roger Baldwin and his coworker, 29-year-old Peter Holmes, frantically crawled on hands and knees as fast as they could down a hallway towards the door of their apartment. And the reason they were crawling and not standing and walking or running is because this was no ordinary apartment. This apartment was basically like a metal box with a bunch of interconnected metal tubes that was located 200 miles off the coast of Scotland, basically out in the middle of the ocean, and it was also underwater. And the reason for that is it was connected to an offshore oil rig. And oil rigs often need divers, like deep sea divers, to work on the rig down deep in the water. But if you know anything about underwater diving, especially deep underwater diving, is that it's not as simple as just throwing on some scuba tanks and going down into the water and doing your work and coming back up again. No, if you're working on an oil rig down at depth, like an underwater welder or anybody who does work for a while deep underwater, there's lots of risks associated with going from the surface down deep where there's really intense pressures and you're breathing in different mixed gases that can interact with your body in sort of very terrible ways. It's dangerous. That's the reality of it. Going down to depth and then coming back up again is a very dangerous process unless you know what you're doing. It's more efficient for owners of oil rigs to construct these pressurized apartments underwater for their deep sea divers to live in, so that when they go out to the rig, they only have to go down to depth once, live in the apartment, which imagine a cup that you just push down into water. There's like an air pocket, right? You push it deep into the water. They basically would swim up under into this apartment deep underwater, and they live there and dive back out of there, do their work, come back into their apartment, but their bodies never really leave the working depth until the end of their shift, whether it's weeks or months or however long they're out there, and then they only have to decompress one time. So in essence, you get to work, you go down deep, and you stay there effectively for a long time, and then when you're done working, you go back to the surface. And so that's why that apartment existed, and that's sort of the setup for these two guys. They've been living underwater. But at that moment, Roger and Peter were not thinking about their diving responsibilities. They were rushing down this metal tube hallway that led to their apartment because over the intercom, the folks on the surface, their supervisor, had communicated down to them that there was some sort of leak happening in the hallway. And so they basically had to rush into their apartment and seal the door behind them before the air basically vanished in the hallway and they suffocated. So they're crawling as fast as they can. They finally get to their apartment door. They open it up, they go inside, they shut it, and they seal it. And now they're sitting there with their backs against the door, hoping that the leak was contained to the hallway. And they're looking up into the corner of their small metal room, their main living space, where there's bunks and there's also the entrance down into the water, basically right in front of them. And there's this camera up in the corner of this room looking down at them. And they have no way to directly communicate with their supervisor on the surface, but they know their supervisor has access to that camera and he's looking at them on his monitor, in his black and white, monitor. And so they're looking up at this camera, hoping that their supervisor is watching them and is doing everything he needs to do to officially contain this leak. Basically, Roger and Peter, they can shut their door, but they can't fully seal it. The full seal comes when somebody on the surface, their supervisor, injects helium into their room, basically adds more pressure to their room, which then sucks the door fully sealed, and then they're safe. And so Roger and Peter, they're listening carefully for the sound of that injection of helium into the room, and eventually they hear it, and there's some creaking on the door, and it sounds very much like their door is fully sealed, and now they're safe. And so Roger and Peter, they step away from the door, they sort of look up at the camera and say thank you, and they're like, all right, I hope that leak out in the hallway is our only issue here. Now, it's worth pointing out that things like this, as terrifying as that would be, you're deep underwater and over the intercom, they're saying there's a leak, like that would be horrifying, but this is a really dangerous job. And unfortunately, leaks and other things like that just sort of happened. And so Roger and Peter were kind of accustomed to things like this happening. And they just had to, hope that the folks on the surface would do their best to, mitigate the problems and, keep them safe. At this point, though, Roger and Peter knew that, it didn't seem like there were any other emergencies here. Whatever leak was happening in the hallway, that could be dealt with. If they had to, they could actually just leave their apartment with their diving equipment on and make their way back up to the surface. Like, there were ways for them to get out of here. And they're thinking, okay, our room has been fully sealed off. We heard the helium be injected into the room. The door's shut behind us. Like, we're good. And again, they can't directly communicate to the supervisor. The supervisor's not saying anything over the intercom. And so they think, okay, it's good for us to just take our stuff off and go to bed. And so that's what they do. They take off their diving equipment and they climb into their beds and they turn out the lights. At the same time they were climbing into bed, their supervisor up on the surface, a guy named Reed Arnold, who'd been talking to them over the intercom, he was sitting there looking at this big control panel with all these switches and gauges and monitors that controlled their underwater apartment. And unfortunately for him, even though it did seem like the leak in the hallway was relatively contained, although it still was leaking, he was also now noticing that there was another problem that he wasn't telling Roger and Peter about yet. And that was, apparently, the door to their apartment, despite them closing it clearly and him injecting helium into the room, following all the steps, it appeared like the door somehow did not fully seal, which meant there was a slow leak. And over time, if this wasn't fixed, the pressure would drop so severely in that room that, that could be fatal for Roger and Peter. Like, this is an emergency, but it's sort of a slow one. And so Reed took a minute and kind of assessed the situation. And, the only thing he could do to try to close this door to fully seal it, let's say, is to inject more helium into Roger and Peter's room. Not enough to harm them, but just enough to further push that door closed. And so he did that. He injected a little bit more helium, and he's watching the gauge of their room, become even more pressurized. But the indicator that showed whether or not the door was sealed continued to show that it was not. And so as Reed is sitting there wondering what he's going to do next, he looked over at the monitor that was the live feed into the room, where he could actually watch Roger and Peter, that camera in the corner of the room, and he sees the two men are laying in their beds, but then sort of out of nowhere, they both get up, climb off their beds, and they hustle over to the door, the leaky door, and they start trying to open it. But from the feed, as he's looking at it, it seems very apparent that they can't get the door to open. It's like it's stuck. And Reed's thinking to himself, that doesn't make any sense. I have this indication light that says the door isn't sealed, so even if it was a challenge to open the door, it's not pressure sealed. They should be able to open it. So what is going on here? And so Reed, he's beginning to panic a little bit because he just doesn't understand what's happening here. And as he's watching Roger and Peter, they go from frantically trying to open this door to almost in unison stopping, turning around, walking over to their bunks, and then grabbing their mattresses, taking them off. And then Roger and Peter climbed on to their metal bed springs and began rolling around on the metal. Now, it's worth pointing out that there are some diving-related injuries, like from being at depth for too long, or, hypercapnia, where you have too much CO2 in your system. There's a whole bunch of things that can basically mess with your mind. And so Reed's thinking, oh my goodness, something's happened that's given these guys some sort of diving-related injury. Like, they're acting crazy. This must be a product of something wrong. They're breathing the wrong mixture of gas. Maybe there's too much helium. Maybe there's too much CO2. I don't know what's going on, but there is an issue here that's messing with their brains. That's the only explanation for why they could be doing something so bizarre. And so at this point, Reed decides all he can do is just continue to put more helium into that room to try to seal that door. Maybe there's some sort of toxic gas that's getting into their space that's causing them to hallucinate or go crazy or who knows what. And so he's just firing off this button, adding more and more helium into the room. And after doing this for several minutes and still watching on the monitor as Roger and Peter continue to do this weird writhing around on their bed frames, that was around the time that Reed really focused on his controls. Am I missing something? Is there some other indication on here that gives away what's going on here? And that's when he realized he had made a terrible mistake. It would turn out Reed had misread the control panel. There really had been a leak in the hallway, and he was right to tell Peter and Roger to rush into their apartment. But once they were inside the apartment and they shut the door, and then Reed injected helium into their room, he actually did seal that room off. There was no issue in their apartment. They were totally safe. There was no problem. He was just misreading the control panel. He thought when he saw this additional indication that, the apartment door had not sealed, that was indicative of a leak in their apartment. But no, the controls were really trying to tell him that, hey, there's still a leak in the hallway right outside of their apartment. And so basically what Reed ended up doing by injecting more and more helium into the apartment where Roger and Peter were, is he was creating a deadly pressure chamber.
And the reason the men began acting the way they were is because the room was getting hotter and hotter and hotter from all this pressure. They could feel it, building inside of the space. And so they didn't know what was going on. They tried to get out, but they couldn't open the door because it was pressure sealed. And then they took their mattresses off their bed and began rolling around on the metal to try to cool down. But it was so intensely hot and it was so pressurized that you can imagine the chaos and panic these two men felt. Maybe theoretically they could have thrown on all their equipment and dove out of there, but you gotta remember this is happening abruptly and they're basically boiling alive. And so it's like full-blown fight or flight mode, and these men are just trying to cool down, but they can't. And so every time Reed injected more and more helium into that room, he was raising the pressure and therefore the temperature in that small space, and eventually he boiled Roger and Peter alive. In the end, the supervisor, Reed, did not actually face any criminal charges because, one, it was a genuine mistake, but two, the mistake was one that many people would have made. There was basically an issue with this control board that sort of presented problems in a sort of ambiguous way. And so it really wasn't Reed being negligent, it was just a flaw in the control panel.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Teapot.
On June 30th, 2002, an 18-year-old named Daniel Dick was on vacation with his mother and his two younger brothers in Hawaii. Daniel had just graduated from his high school in Los Angeles, where he was the student body president. He was known to invite all of his classmates over to his house all the time for dinners, and girls would call him all the time to try to get advice about their boyfriends. And Daniel also would befriend troubled teens in an attempt to kind of pick them up and get them back on the straight and narrow. When he and his family left for this vacation, he had been working part-time at a grocery store and was getting ready to attend California State University in the fall. That morning, Daniel went down to the beach where he planned on doing some swimming and maybe laying out in the sun for a little bit, and pretty quickly he met three girls, and after about 30 minutes of chatting with them, he asked them if they wanted to climb over the fence and check out the blowhole. A blowhole is a fairly narrow hole that is situated on rocks right near where water is crashing, and this hole is usually formed by molten lava that has passed through underneath. And what happens is this hole is connected to a tunnel that feeds down and out into the water. So when the waves come in, they go through this tunnel and they get rocketed up this little opening, causing a massive geyser of water. Now, if you don't go near the blowhole, it's not dangerous at all. It's just a very cool natural phenomenon. The beach that Daniel and these girls were on was situated right near an infamously dangerous blowhole called the Halona Blowhole. The reason it was so dangerous is because the water it connected to through that tunnel was some of the most violent in all of Hawaii. So when those waves came barreling through the tunnel, it would shoot 30 plus feet in the air. And so to make sure everybody understood you're only allowed to watch the blowhole from a distance, they actually put up a fence all the way around it and put up signs saying, "Do not go any closer." To give you a sense of how powerful the water was that was churning through this tunnel, if you were standing on the other side of the fence watching the blowhole from a safe distance, you could feel the ground shaking as the waves would rumble through the tunnel and then explode out of the blowhole. According to Daniel's family and friends, he was not a reckless person, he was just a very adventurous person. And so something like this blowhole really piqued his interest, and he just couldn't handle being on the outside of the fence. He really wanted to get right up there and get a look at it. In fact, he told these girls he wanted to feel the power of the water hit him in the chest. That was his plan. The girls told him this was a bad idea, but he was insistent and he began walking over to the rocks where you could climb up and jump this fence. The girls went with him, but they stopped short of the fence. As Daniel made his way over to the rocks, he passed by a couple that was laying on the beach. He waved to them, he climbed up the rocks, he climbed over the fence, and he made his way over to the blowhole. And he timed it to where a wave had just come in and shot a geyser up, and then as soon as the water went down and there was a break, he walked over the edge of this hole that was not very far across, and he kind of arched himself over it so his chest was hovering right over where the water was going to come up. And initially, a wave came through and the water shot up and it hit him in the chest and it kind of staggered him back for a minute. And at this point, the three girls and the couple that he had passed are now yelling for him to get away from the blowhole, that it's way too dangerous. but it was too late. He leaned back over the blowhole right as a massive wave came barreling through the tunnel. It rocketed up and it lifted him off the ground about 5 feet in the air, and it turned him upside down so his head is pointed down. And when he fell, he went directly into the blowhole. The couple and the 3 girls that saw this happen described his body position as being the perfect dive. And in order to actually get into the blowhole, you would need the perfect body position because the opening is very narrow and it goes down 8 feet of just this narrow tube. And at the bottom of that, it opens up like the inside of a teapot. And inside of there is this just vicious churning water that connects to this underground tunnel that feeds out to the sea. And so when Daniel went head first down, his momentum, along with his perfect body position, forced himself down through that hole into that section that's kind of like the inside of a teapot. And once you're inside, there's no way to go back up again. The opening is too tight and there's nothing to hold on to. You wouldn't have the ability to force yourself up through that hole again. So the only way out is through the underground tunnel that leads out to the sea. But there are constantly waves pounding their way up this tunnel into the section where Daniel had fallen into. And so realistically, anybody that tries to swim through this fairly long underground tunnel is only going to get so far before a wave forces them back or traps them in some way in this underground tunnel. As soon as Daniel went into the blowhole, the couple and the 3 girls immediately climbed up the rocks, hopped over the fence, and began looking into the tunnel, yelling for Daniel. And as they're sitting there yelling for him and yelling for people on the beach to call 911, they would feel the ground start to shake as another wave would come through the tunnel and erupt through the blowhole. And they know every time that happened, Daniel, if he was alive, he was completely submerged in water for 30 seconds or so every iteration that this blowhole erupted. By the time the police showed up, Daniel has been trapped inside of this blowhole for some time, and no one's heard him, no one's seen him, and so it's starting to look pretty grim. And the police would say it's nearly impossible for anybody to survive being inside of this blowhole, especially at high tide, which is when he went in. In fact, the police would say we can't even send divers in there until low tide, because if we send someone in now, they're gonna get killed inside of this blowhole. It's too violent inside of there. And so the best they could do was put a weighted line into the blowhole anchored on the outside so that if by some miracle Daniel was still alive, he'd be able to grab this line and pull himself up. He probably would not be able to pull himself through the hole to safety, but at least he could keep himself out of the water until rescuers could get there the next day at low tide. But when low tide came the next day and divers went out to the water, they discovered Daniel's body. It was floating near the area where water actually gets sucked into the tunnel and out through the blowhole. During low tide, he must have been pulled back out through the tunnel out to sea. It's unclear how long Daniel was alive once he landed inside of the blowhole, or whether he ever attempted to actually swim through that tunnel out to sea, but at some point he did drown. Daniel's mother petitioned to have a metal grate put over the blowhole so that nobody else would fall in and meet the same fate as her son. But this proposal was met with criticism from the locals, who said the problem was not the blowhole, the problem was people not respecting the power of nature. And so while a fence still surrounds Halona Blowhole telling people to stay back, the entrance to the blowhole is still uncovered.
Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts, or visit SiriusXM.com/podcastplus to listen with Spotify or another app of